So we are continuing to read The Hobbit. I've already opened the book, but we are here on page 101. And there's a few things that I annotated from the last time we read. Remember, Bilbo has found the dwarves, but he's getting very hungry now because now the worry has passed. And Gandalf is telling the party, we've got to go because goblins can smell our footsteps for hours and hours after we passed. And that kind of appeals to your senses in the book, but I try to relate everything to real life. I want you to think about your digital footprint and your social media footprint. Years can have passed and someone will bring something up. So your trail in today's world is long. The other thing he used, he kind of told them which way they were going to go. They had gotten through the mountains, but they were too far north. And then Bilbo said he was dreadfully hungry. And then I want you to think about this when Gandalf says, well, we don't have time for a meal. We don't have any food. And Gandalf said, we can't help it unless you'd like to go back and ask the goblins nicely to let you have your pony back and your luggage. So sometimes when your friends and your loved ones are distressed or complaining about something, you can kind of show them their thoughts. We can't help it unless you'd like to go do this. And usually they will realize, no, that's not what I want to do. And he said, okay then, so your choice was to go on ahead. We must just tighten our belts and trudge on, or we shall be made into supper, and that will be much worse than having none ourselves. So sometimes we're just the perspective givers in our friends and families, or even your own life. Well, I'd really love to go do this, but in order for that to happen, would you like to just go back and do this? Probably not. Okay. So Bilbo, they still, I'm on page 101, they still went on and on. The rough path disappeared, the bushes and the long grasses between the boulders, the patches of rabbit-cropped turf, the thyme and the sage and the magicorum and the yellow rock roses all vanished. And they found themselves at the top of a wide, steep slope of fallen stones, the remains of a landslide. When they began to go down this, rubbish and small pebbles rolled away from their feet. If anybody has ever walked down the side of a volcano, I haven't, but I have friends have, and they say that it's very loose soil and you sink like ankles, calves up, and it's very rough. Soon larger bits of split stone went clattering down and started other pieces below them slithering and rolling. Then lumps of rocks were disturbed and bounded off, crashing down with a dust and a noise. Before long, the whole slope above them and below them seemed on the move, and they were sliding away, huddled all together in a fearful confusion of slipping, rattling, cracking slabs and stones. It was the trees at the bottom that saved them. They slid into the edge of a climbing wood of pines that here stood right up the mountain slope from the deeper, darker forests of the valleys below. Some caught hold of the trunks and swung themselves into lower branches. Some, like the little hobbit, got behind a tree to shelter from the onslaught of the rocks. Soon the danger was over, the slide had stopped, and the last faint crashes could be heard as the largest of the disturbed stones went bounding and spinning among the bracken and the pine roots far below. Well, that has got us on a bit, said Gandalf, and even goblins tracking us will have a job to come down here quietly. I dare say, grumbled Bamor, but they won't find it difficult to send stones bouncing down on our heads. The dwarves and Bilbo were feeling far from happy and were rumbling their bruised and damaged legs and feet. Nonsense. We are going to turn aside here out of the path of the slide. We must be quick. Look at the light." The sun had long gone behind the mountains. Already the shadows were deepening about them, though far away through the trees and over the black tops of those growing lower down, they could still see the evening lights on the plains beyond. They limped along now as fast as they were able, down the gentle slopes of a pine forest in a slanting path leading steadily southwards. At times they were pushing through a sea of bracken with tall fronds. And I might need to look up the word bracken, but it's part of a tree. I can imagine walking through a forest that's very dense pine trees, with tall fronds rising right above the hobbit's head. At times they were marching along quiet, over a floor of pine needles, and all the while the forest gloom got heavier and the forest silence deeper. So they're walking into this forest where the trees are so thick that it's blocking out any light that might get through, even though it's getting well into night. There was no wind that evening to bring even a sea sighting into the branches of the trees. "Must we go any further?" asked Bilbo, when it was so dark that he could only just see Thorin's beard wagging beside him, and so quiet that he could hear the dwarves breathing like a loud noise. "My toes are all bruised and bent, and my legs ache, and my stomach is wagging like an empty sack." "A bit further," said Gandalf. After what seemed ages further, they came suddenly to an opening where no trees grew. The moon was up and was shining into the clearing. Somehow it struck all of them not at all a nice place, although there was nothing wrong to see. So they just get a gut feeling that there's a reason that there are no trees here. All of a sudden they heard a howl away downhill, a long, shuddering howl. It was answered by another away to the right and a good deal nearer to them, then by another not far away to the left. It was wolves howling at the moon, wolves gathering together. There were no wolves living near Mr. Baggins's hole at home, but he knew that noise. He had had it described to him often enough in tales. One of his elder cousins on the Took side, who had been a great traveler, used to imitate it to frighten him. To hear it out in the forest under the moon was too much for Bilbo. Even magic rings are not much use against wolves, especially against the evil packs that lived under the shadow of a goblin-infested mountains, over the edge of the wild on the borders of the unknown. Wolves of that sort smell keener than goblins. So if you don't know what the word keener is, they're comparing them to goblins. So if they smell better than goblins, you can substitute a word and see if it makes sense. And do not need to see you to catch you. Because remember, the ring just makes him invisible. He still has a shadow, and he still can kind of be smelled or heard a little bit. "What shall we do? What shall we do?" he cried. "Escaping goblins to be caught by wolves," he said, and it became a proverb, though we now say "out of the frying pan into the fire" in the same sort of uncomfortable situations. So they've explained that. Escaping goblins to be caught by wolves is out of the frying pan into the fire, which means the situation is either just as bad or worse. "Up the trees, quick," cried Gandalf, and they ran to the trees at the edge of the glade, hunting for those that had branches fairly low or were slender enough to swarm up. They found them as quick as they ever could, you can guess, and up they went as high as ever they could trust the branches. You would have laughed from a safe distance if you had seen the dwarves sitting up in the trees with their beards dangling down like old gentlemen gone cracked and playing at being boys. Fili and Kili were at the top of a tall larch like an enormous Christmas tree. Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin were more comfortable in huge pine with regular branches sticking out at intervals, like the spokes of a wheel. Biffer, Bofer, Barmore, and Thorin were in another. Dwalin and Balin had swarmed up a tall, slender fir with few branches and were trying to find a place to sit in the greenery of the topmost boughs. So a lot of diagramming of trees, but if you don't know what the word boughs are, you can imagine they said topmost, so it kind of gets sparse up there. Gandalf, who was a good deal taller than the others, had found a tree into which they could not climb, a large pine standing at the very edge of the glade. He was quite hidden in its boughs, but you could see his eyes gleaming in the moon as he peeped out. Ooh. And Bilbo? He could not get into any tree and was scuttling about from trunk to trunk, like a rabbit that has lost its hole and has a dog after it. "You've left the burglar behind again," said Nori, to Dori looking down. "I can't always be carrying burglars on my back," said Dori. "Down tunnels and up trees. What do you think I am, a porter?" "He'll be eaten if we don't do something," said Thorin, for there were howls all around them now, getting nearer and nearer. "Dori," he called, for Dori was lowest down in the easiest tree. "Be quick and give Mr. Bagginses a hand up." Dori really was a decent fellow in spite of his grumbling. Poor Bilbo could not reach his hand, even when he climbed down to the bottom branch and hung his arm down as far as he ever could. So Dori actually climbed out of the tree and let Bilbo scramble up and stand on his back. Just at that moment, the wolves trotted howling into the clearing. All of a sudden, there were hundreds of eyes looking at them. Still, Dori did not let Bilbo down. He waited till he had clambered off his shoulders into the branches, and then he jumped for the branches himself, only just in time. A wolf snapped at his cloak as he swung up and nearly got him. In a minute, there was a whole pack of them yelping all around the tree and leaping up at the trunk, with eyes blazing and tongues hanging out. But even the wild wargs, that's a difficult word, it's W-A-R-G-S. For so the evil wolves over the edge of the wild were named, cannot climb trees. For a time they were safe. Luckily, it was warm and not windy. Trees are not very comfortable to sit in for long at any time, but in the cold and the wind, with wolves all around below waiting for you, they can be perfectly miserable places. This glade and the ring of trees was evidently a meeting place of the wolves. More and more kept coming in. They left guards at the foot of the tree in which Dori and Bilbo were, and then went sniffing about till they had smelt out every tree that had anyone in it. These they guarded too, while all the rest, hundreds and hundreds it seemed, went and sat in a great circle in the glade, and in the middle of the circle was a great gray wolf. He spoke to them in the dreadful language of the wargs. Gandalf understood it. Bilbo did not, but it sounded terrible to him, and as if all their talk was about cruel and wicked things, as it was. Every now and then all the wargs in the circle would answer their gray chief all together, and their dreadful clamoring almost made the hobbit fall out of his pine tree. I will tell you what Gandalf heard, though Bilbo did not understand it. The wargs and the goblins often helped one another in wicked deeds. Goblins do not usually venture very far from their mountains unless they are driven out and are looking for new homes or are marching to war, which I am glad to say has not happened for a long while. But in those days, they sometimes used to go on raids, especially to get food or slaves to work for them. Then they often got the wargs to help and shared the plunder with them. Sometimes they rode on wolves like men do on horses. Now it seemed that a great goblin raid had been planned for that very night. The wargs had come to meet the goblins, and the goblins were late. The reason, no doubt, was the death of the great goblin, and all the excitement caused by the dwarves and Bilbo and the wizard, for whom they were probably still hunting. In spite of the dangers of this far land, bold men had of late been making their way back into it from the south. So in spite of this, having goblins and wolves, these wargs, which are wolves, people from the south are migrating back to the mountains. Cutting down trees and building themselves places to live in among the more pleasant woods in the valleys and along the river shores. There were many of them, and they were brave and well armed, and even the wargs dared not attack them if there were many together or in the bright day. But now they had planned with the goblins to come by night upon some of the villages nearest the mountains. If their plan had been carried out, there would have been none left next day. All would have been killed except the few the goblins kept from the wolves and carried back as prisoners to their caves. This was dreadful talk to listen to, not only because of the brave woodmen and their wives and children, but also because of the danger which now threatened Gandalf and his friends. The wargs were angry and puzzled at finding them in their very meeting place. They thought they were friends of the woodmen and were come to spy on them and would take news of their plans down into the valleys. And then the goblins and the wolves would have to fight a terrible battle instead of capturing prisoners and devouring people waked suddenly from their sleep. So the wargs have no intention of going away and letting the people up the trees escape, at any rate not until morning. And long before that, they said, goblin soldiers would be coming down the mountains, and goblins can climb trees or cut them down. Now you can understand why Gandalf, listening to their growling and yelping, began to be dreadfully afraid, wizard though he was, and to feel that they were in a very bad place and had not yet escaped at all. All the same, he was not going to let them have it all their own way. So this looks like a really bad situation, right? The wizard is worried, and if your most powerful, knowledgeable person is worried, and then maybe you should be too. But we also know that Bilbo has something now that he didn't have before. And so you can kind of start to predict maybe Bilbo can help them. I'm not sure how yet, but he does have an edge. So all the same, he was not going to let them have it all their own way, though he could not do very much stuck up in a tall tree with wolves all around on the ground below. He gathered the huge pine cones from the branches of his tree. Then he set one alight with bright blue fire and threw it whizzing down among the circle of the wolves. It struck one on the back, and immediately his shaggy coat caught fire, and he was leaping to and fro, yelping horribly. Then another came, and another, one in blue flames, one in red, another in green. They burst on the ground in the middle of the circle and went off in colored sparks and smoke. A especially large one hit the chief wolf on the nose, and he leapt in the air 10 feet, and then rushed around and round the circle, biting and snapping, even at the other wolves in his anger and fright. The dwarves and Bilbo shouted and cheered. The rage of the wolves was terrible to see, and the commotion they made filled all the forest. Wolves are afraid of fire at all times, but this was a most horrible and uncanny fire. If a spark got in their coats and stuck and burned into them, and unless they rolled over quick, they were soon all in flames. Very soon, all about the glade, wolves were rolling over and over to put out the sparks on their backs, while those that were burning were running about, howling and setting others alight. till their own friends chased them away, and they fled off down the slopes, crying and yammering and looking for water. So, the wolves have kind of gone away, thanks to Gandalf, but you can imagine that they're still stuck up in the trees, and their wolves and the goblins are coming down the mountains, and the wolves have let on that they plan to go into this village at night when people are sleeping, kill people, take prisoners, and they think that the dwarves and Bilbo and Gandalf are there to spy on them, so they're kind of waiting for the goblins to cut the trees down and get them out of the trees. But they've now had to run off for a little bit, so we will stop there. We're on page 107. So in about 20 minutes, we started on page 101, so we read about 6 pages. We are currently here. So take your 20 minutes, read, take the day to think about it, and then come back either in the evening or the morning and read for another 20 minutes, and you will have accomplished, gotten your way little bit by little bit through a book.